Each Halloween, we gather to hear stories of haunts, spooks, and strange happenings set in this wonderful place we call home. Tonight, we'll travel to Benzie, Roscommon, and Wexford counties, and to the middle of Lake Michigan. So turn down the lights. It's time to see how well your spine can shiver. This is The Haunting of Northwest Michigan. Chuck was an animal lover. He owned a small piece of land in northern Wexford County that his real estate agent had called a bachelor farm. Since Chuck was 35 and unmarried, this description fit. He lived alone, but he was hardly lonely. Chuck had adopted a very old swayback horse, several rabbits and chickens, a goat that ate almost everything in sight, a dozen or so barn cats that more often slept in the house, and a very old, gray-muzzled, nearly blind black lab he had gotten from the Humane Society. This dog, who became Chuck's best friend and loyal companion, he had named Goon. In the 3 years since Goon had come to live on the farm, Chuck had heard him bark precisely once. On a very hot summer night, a pack of coyotes had roamed onto the property and were menacing the chicken house. Goon raised his head and growled. Chuck muted his TV and went to the front porch with his flashlight. In a few seconds, the flashlight beam reflected back several pairs of orange eyes. Goon raced past Chuck, slamming the screen door open and dashing off toward the chicken house. He let out a deep, thundering bark, and the glowing orange eyes scattered in every direction. Fearing the coyotes might turn and attack his old blind dog, Chuck called for him to return. Goon didn't listen. He zeroed in on the sound of one of the scampering coyotes and nipped hard at his tail and heels. Chuck heard a screeching yelp. A few minutes later, Goon proudly trotted back up to the porch, panting and wagging his tail. The coyotes never returned. It was 6 months later, in the dead of winter, before Chuck heard Goon bark again. It was late afternoon, just before sunset. They had returned home from plowing a neighbor's driveway, and Chuck was looking forward to a night of basketball, pizza, and a few beers. Goon hopped from the cab of the truck and walked beside Chuck toward the front door. Suddenly, he froze in place. The fur on his neck and spine rose. He lowered his head and growled, peering and sniffing toward the scrub woods just past the house. "What is it, boy?" Chuck said, following Goon's line of sight. He saw nothing but poplar trees and tangled branches of sumac at the edge of the yard. Goon let out a tremendous bark, which made Chuck jump. He walked back to the dog and squatted beside him. Goon was frozen in place, still staring toward the woods, his ears forward, his teeth bared. A guttural growl rumbled from deep inside him. Chuck reached up and put a hand on Goon's back. The dog looked up at him, and his face immediately returned to its normal, calm, happy state. As Chuck smiled back at Goon, from the corner of his own eye, he saw movement. It was only for a split second, and when he looked toward the source, nothing was there. He looked back at Goon, and in his peripheral vision, he saw it again. This time, it was defined. He was looking at a tall man and a brownish-colored dog, standing together at the edge of the woods. The man was waving to him. Chuck blinked, stood, and turned to face the woods again. The man and the dog were gone. Goon wagged his tail. He had now completely returned to a state of calm. "We must be working too hard, boy," Chuck said to him, shaking his head. He looked back toward the woods again. He couldn't see any sign of the man or the dog, and no obvious tracks in the snow. A few hours, half a pizza, and several beers later, Chuck had almost forgotten the strange moment in the front yard. The game was a good one, only 2 points separating the Pistons and Cavaliers, less than 3 minutes to go. Goon was sleeping peacefully next to the pot-bellied wood stove. Chuck got up to use the bathroom, and while there, he heard Goon get up and trot toward the front door. For only the third time since he'd known him, and the second time today, he heard that big, powerful, menacing bark. Chuck walked into the dining room and found Goon standing by the door of the screen porch. He looked outside but saw nothing. Goon growled. His tail stood straight out and flat. Chuck opened the inner door and flicked on the porch light. Still, he could see nothing. Goon slid past him and barked again, this time repeatedly. Chuck reached down to quiet him, and in his peripheral vision, he saw the tall man clearly. He was standing just outside the screen door, bathed in the porch light. Chuck snapped upright, and when he looked straight at him, the man was gone. So Chuck slowly turned his head back toward Goon, and the man reappeared in the corner of his vision. He was wearing a brown duck coat with white sheepskin trim and a red and black checkered wool hat. His large brown dog jumped up, his front paws scratching at the wooden outer door. Chuck, shocked, spun and fell backward, his head slamming against the threshold of the inner door. Just before he fell unconscious, he saw the tall man and the brown dog looking in at him. The man smiled and waved at Chuck. When he came to, it was morning and freezing cold on the porch. Goon was lying quiet beside him. Too quiet. Chuck reached over to feel for the dog's breathing. Goon was cold and still. Sometime during the night, he had slipped away. Chuck stood, shivering. He looked out through the outer door. In the snow outside, he saw the tracks of a man leading away from the porch toward the woods. On either side of the man's footprints were the tracks of dogs. This time, 2 dogs. The haunting of Northwest Michigan. In almost every way, Jody was a typical teenage girl. Her bedroom walls were covered with posters from boy bands. She kept a diary, and she had a huge crush on a super cute senior who she was pretty sure didn't know she was alive. But in one way, Jody was not typical. During her sophomore year at Pine River High School, she struggled with insomnia. Getting to sleep was a challenge, as her mind always seemed to be going at hyperspeed. If she did fall asleep, she often came suddenly wide awake in the wee hours of the morning and lay staring at the dark room until dawn. She told her mother about it one morning on the way to school. Jody was surprised to hear that her father had the same problem from time to time. They agreed that if it continued much longer, Jody would go see the family doctor. A few nights later, Jody awoke with a start at 2:30 a.m. She could hear rain pelting on the roof above her head, and lightning occasionally illuminated the shades of her bedroom window. Oddly, even though the lightning was bright, there was no thunder. She lay there for several minutes, watching the flashes. Then, something struck her as even more odd. About every third or fourth flash of lightning, the window shade became noticeably brighter. It took her drowsy mind a few minutes to figure out why. It seemed the source of these brighter flashes was not from outside, but from inside her room. Jody pulled the covers up to partially cover her face and rolled over slowly. The room was almost pitch dark, but when the lightning flashed, she saw something that sent a chill into her spine. 5 feet from her bed sat a folding lawn chair. It was one of the old kind, with a crosshatch of green webbing stretched over an aluminum frame. She was facing the back of the chair, which she was sure had not been in her room when she went to bed. In fact, she couldn't remember ever having seen this chair in the house at all. Then Jody realized it wasn't just the chair that was causing her fear. Someone was sitting in it, facing away from her. It was a young man, perhaps 20, with a very short haircut like her grandfather used to wear. She thought it was called a flat top. The young man was in silhouette, surrounded by a greenish glow. Jody's mind raced. The chair sat between her bed and the door. There was no way she could sneak away. The man didn't seem to notice her. He just stared down toward his knees. Should she scream? Her parents' room was on the other side of the house. If this person was dangerous, he would get to her much faster than her father. In the midst of these thoughts, the man in the chair tossed a ball into the air and caught it on the way down. It was about the size of a soccer ball, but it was transparent and filled with some kind of luminous liquid that glowed an eerie green. Mustering all the courage she could, Jody said, "Who are you? Why are you in my room?" The man didn't turn around, but he did speak. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Then he tossed the glowing ball into the air again and caught it. Jody wasn't sure how to respond. Then she said, "I think you'd better get out of here or I'll call my father. He has a gun." "So does mine," the man said, still looking the other direction. "That makes us even." Jody began to wonder if this was a dream or some kind of sleep-deprived hallucination. "Are you going to hurt me?" she asked quietly. "Don't be silly," the man chuckled. "Why would I do that?" He tossed the ball into the air again, and before it dropped, he and the chair vanished into a misty cloud, then disappeared completely. For a few minutes, Jody couldn't move. Then she reached out and turned on her bedside lamp. Lightning flashed outside, and this time a rumble of thunder followed a few seconds later. The man had definitely disappeared. She got up and looked at the carpet where the lawn chair had been sitting. There were no impressions from the legs of the chair in the carpet. She considered waking her parents, but after a few minutes was able to convince herself it really had been a dream. Still, she dragged the blanket from her bed, went to the family room, and spent the rest of the night on the sofa. She fell into a deep sleep almost immediately and would have overslept if her mom had not awakened her for school. "You're going to be late for the bus, kiddo," she said. "Come on, I'll drive you to school." An hour later, while they drove toward Pine River, Jody related to her mother about the strange events of the night before. She talked about it dismissively, describing it as the dream she was now sure it had been. That's when she noticed her mother's knuckles. They had grown white on the steering wheel. She pulled to the side of the road and turned to Jody. "Did he toss a green ball?" Jody, quivering and surprised, said yes. It glowed. Her mother chewed at a fingernail for a moment, then looked straight at Jody. "Your father saw the same thing in our bedroom. The lawn chair facing backward, the man and the ball. It kept him awake almost all night. He said the man talked to him. Dad was so exhausted this morning he almost didn't go to work. We talked about it but decided not to tell you because it would only scare you. Now I'm the one who's scared." Jody and her family never saw the strange apparition again and never could find a reason for his appearance. If only Jody or her father had seen it, we too could dismiss it as merely a dream. That both saw it, in separate rooms, on the same night, can only mean one thing. It's part of the haunting of Northwest Michigan. The following story was submitted by a listener named Amanda in 2013. Over a period of many months, Amanda and her husband worked hard to build their new home on several acres of an old farmstead in Benzie County. 2 months after moving in, strange things began happening. They would be awakened night after night by the smoke and fire alarms going off, although there was no smoke or excessive heat to trigger them. The alarms went off at the same time every night, 3 a.m. Then the couple noticed other unexplained noises. They would hear children playing and laughing, both inside and outside their house, but they never saw these children. Amanda and her husband were expecting their first child, and no children lived nearby. Doors would mysteriously open by themselves, then slam shut. Light bulbs would burn out every month. The beautiful front door of their home was replaced 3 times, because even when locked, it would pop open at random times with no explanation. Guests who came to visit Amanda and her husband would often leave early, complaining of being unable to sleep. One couple told Amanda they were going to a motel after just one night because they had been kept awake by someone bouncing a ball in the basement all night long. 6 months after her son was born, Amanda and her husband were shocked one evening to hear his musical mobile suddenly start up on its own. The mobile was not electronic, but a model that required winding by hand to play. Amanda would also hear their son cooing and babbling in his crib, followed by the voice of a child talking to him. The couple did some digging around the abandoned foundations on the land, hoping to discover some reason for all this strange paranormal activity. They found some old tools and pieces of broken farm equipment, but found no explanations. For now, Amanda says they've chosen to just live with their ghost, or ghosts. Other than spooky and unsettling, nothing to date has been threatening about these events. But one thing they have no doubts about: their home is a textbook example of the haunting of Northwest Michigan. In 1998, Jim Keeler Jr. was a contractor living in Davenport, Iowa. After his mother passed away, he decided to spend his spare time doing genealogical research into his father's family history. Jim's dad had been killed in Vietnam in 1972, just 10 days after Jim Jr. was born. His mother had barely spoken about his father, and Jim had never really known much about him or where he came from. He had never even seen a photograph of his biological father. After visiting a few genealogy websites, he settled on one that promised the broadest collection of public records and offered a free 30-day trial. Jim entered his information, name, address, email, and signed up for an account. After just a few hours, Jim had located his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather's names and traced his lineage back to Roscommon County in northern Michigan. For 3 generations, the Keeler men had all been career military. Jim's father, James Sr., was a squad sergeant in the U.S. Army. His grandfather had piloted PT boats in World War II, and his great-grandfather was a Marine captain who had served as advisor during the Spanish Civil War. His research helped him locate several cousins still in Roscommon County, and he decided to write to several of them to obtain more personal information about his ancestors, particularly his own father. After the first week of research, Jim noticed his email box was getting filled with a lot of spam. He had expected as much. He knew that signing up for a free trial often meant that your name and email would end up on mailing lists for advertising. Every day, his inbox would have dozens of messages, hawking everything from weight loss to other things not discussed in polite company. Jim simply deleted them. But one day, one email was different. In the from field, the name said simply, Nick. There was nothing in the subject line. In the message body, there was no text, just a scan of a black and white photograph. It appeared to be an old Polaroid image. It was a young blonde man changing the tire on a Volkswagen Beetle. Jim studied the image for some time, but could make nothing of it, so he deleted the message. 2 days later, among 30 new spam messages, was another email from Nick. This one contained a grainy color shot of the same young man, this time in a football uniform, clamping his helmet to his side with his arm. The front of the jersey said Bucks. The boy's number was 19. A week later, Jim received another photo from Nick. It was the same young blonde man, in green shorts and a sleeveless T-shirt, with dog tags around his neck and an M16 slung over his shoulder. This time, Jim decided to reply to the message. To alert the sender, he was sending his pictures to the wrong address. A few moments later, his computer chimed with the message, "Undeliverable. Address domain does not exist." Jim deleted the email. That same afternoon, Jim received the first reply letter from a cousin in Roscommon County. Diane wrote that she was the same age as Jim and was the daughter of his aunt and uncle. She and Jim had actually played together as toddlers, but neither could remember the other. However, Diane's mother did remember Jim's father very well. She had gone through her photo albums and found a few pictures of James Sr. They were enclosed in the envelope. Jim was stunned to find that among the photographs were 3 exact duplicates of the photos he had received from Nick in his email. He immediately called Diane, who put him in touch with her mother. She told him she had not scanned or emailed the photos to Jim. They had not been out of her photo album for over 30 years. To her knowledge, they were the only copies of the photos. Jim told her the same images had been emailed to him by someone named Nick. There was a long silence over the phone line. "Jim," she said, "your dad's full name was James Nicholas Keeler. He didn't use his first name. Everyone called him Nick." Jim received no more emails from Nick. Since he had already deleted them from his inbox, he could not recover the 3 that had been sent. He would never know their origin. But he had his suspicions. They may have come from a place where family ties are strong and mystery is deep. A place called The Haunting of Northwest Michigan. During the spring break of 2006, a professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison had flown his private plane to Gaylord to open up the family cabin on Otsego Lake. Some broken pipes at the cabin delayed his return for an extra day, and he was getting pressed for time. He had to get back to Madison to his classes in time for final exams. He filed his flight plan at the Otsego County Airport and took off from runway 27 in the late afternoon. The Weather Service had told him there was unsettled air over Lake Michigan, and he may have to fly a wide circle around the thunderstorms that could pop up without warning. As his Cessna approached the west coast of Michigan near Manistee, he could see the telltale anvil tops of thunderheads in the distance and the occasional muted flash of lightning. The storm was directly in his flight path. After a few moments, the controller directed the professor to fly south along the Michigan shoreline for about 30 miles, then turn back west. After following directions, the professor banked to his right and steered the plane out over Lake Michigan. There were still clouds ahead, but the worst of the storm appeared to pass to the north of him. Minutes later, the windshield turned into a blank white screen as he flew into the cottony cumulus clouds. Unable to see in any direction, he concentrated on his instruments. Within minutes, rain started pelting the windscreen. The hazy white color gradually transformed into an angry purple, and strong winds buffeted his small plane around the sky. The professor reached for his radio microphone to ask the controller if he could climb to a new altitude to get out of the weather. Before he could key his mic, there was a blinding flash. Sparks flew from his instrument panel. The analog gauges spun crazily, and the digital readouts began flickering. Moments later, to his horror, the single engine of the Cessna sputtered and quit. Immediately, the professor's pilot training and instinct kicked in. He grasped the wheel in front of him and put the plane into a gentle gliding descent to maintain airspeed. With his right hand, he snapped power and engine control switches and adjusted his radio. Keying the mic, he repeated, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," the call sign of his aircraft, and, struck by lightning, loss of power, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday." There was no reply. The radio produced only buzzing static. Suddenly, his windshield cleared as he dropped through the bottom of the cloud layer. The rain was falling in gray sheets, and the lake was roiling with whitecaps. His plane was not an efficient glider, and he was losing altitude fast. He frantically worked the panel switches and tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't catch. The professor faced the unwelcome choice of ditching his plane in the ice-cold waters of Lake Michigan. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something his brain could not quite register. There was a small aircraft carrier sitting in the middle of Lake Michigan. He clamped his eyes closed for a second, then opened them wide. He was not seeing things. Just 2 miles off, the carrier was steaming southward. The flight deck was lit up like a Christmas tree. He gently steered his Cessna toward the ship. There was no time to call to request permission to land. He flipped on his landing lights, but decided to leave his landing gear retracted until the very last second. He tried again, unsuccessfully, to restart his engine. As the carrier grew larger, he was able to see the flight deck clearer. There were about a dozen planes aboard, old propeller jobs, tail draggers they used to call them, dark blue with white stars on the fuselage. A crewman appeared on the fantail of the ship, waving big circular yellow paddles. Other crewmen were stringing a catch net across the end of the deck's short runway. A quarter mile from the deck, at 500 feet of altitude, the professor realized he was not going to be able to glide all the way to a landing. He instinctively snapped the switches on the panel one last time, and the engine started. Instantly, he thrust the throttle forward and pulled lightly on his control yoke. The Cessna responded by first increasing speed, then climbing gently. Below him, he roared past, just 50 feet off the flight deck of the carrier. To his right, several men in the distinctive tan of naval officers emerged from the bridge of the ship and waved. The Cessna climbed back into the cloud layer. It was still raining, but patches of blue were showing through above. The professor turned to look over his shoulder at the lake. The carrier was gone. His radio sprang to life with normal traffic from Minneapolis Center. The professor, his hands shaking, called the controller to cancel his mayday. The controller replied they had never heard one. The professor asked to modify his flight plan to land at the nearest airport. In the weeks that followed, the professor did some research on the internet to try and determine why an aircraft carrier would be in Lake Michigan. To his frustration, he found there wasn't one. The last carriers to sail the lake were the USS Sable and the USS Wolverine. They had been training ships that operated out of Great Lakes Naval Air Station in Chicago during World War II. When he saw a black and white picture of the Wolverine, it took his breath away. It was exactly the same carrier he had nearly landed on. Had the professor seen a ghost? Had the lightning strike somehow transported him through a warp in the fabric of time? Or was it simply another illustration of the haunting of Northwest Michigan? We hope you've enjoyed the 2014 edition of The Haunting of Northwest Michigan. Tonight's show has been brought to you by Williams Automax, the home of Northern Michigan's premier selection of pre-owned vehicles, next to the Grand Traverse Mall on US 31 South in Traverse City. If you'd like to download a copy of tonight's show, visit www.michigan-dogman.com and click on the Downloads link. See you next Halloween.